Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary Podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Viddich, Graham Greene, Nick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
And welcome to episode 197 of the Spybrary Podcast. There must be something in the water at the moment because we bring you a conversation today with another former member of the British Parliament. You remember we spoke with Nigel West, the intelligence historian, a couple of weeks ago. Today, we're kind of crossing the aisle, as it were. We're chatting with Alan Johnson. He was a Labour MP for 20 years before retiring ahead of the 2017 general election. He served in 5 cabinet positions, including Education Secretary, Health Secretary, and I think what's most of interest to us here at Spybrary, he was also Home Secretary. So that means he would have been Harry Pearce's boss if you watch Spooks MI5. The Director General of MI5 would report into the Home Secretary. He's now turned his hand to fiction. He's very well known for his memoirs. He's written 2 books, The Late Train to Gipsy Hill, and One of Our Ministers is Missing. Now, I want to caution you, first of all, yes, he is an ex-politician. This isn't a heavy dialogue-laden political thriller, right? This isn't Michael Dobbs' House of Cards or Jeffrey Archer, First Among Equals. This is a really good thriller story. I know quite a few Spybrarians have already read Late Train to Gipsy Hill. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Very Ambler-esque for me, and I pay Alan that compliment in the interview. So we talk about both books, and also I ask him at the very end of the interview, I couldn't resist. Like, I know he signed the Official Secret Acts. I know he can't tell us much about what happened in his relations with MI5, but I do ask Alan what advice he would give for an incoming Home Secretary in terms of managing that relation with MI5. So stick around for that. Hope you enjoy this interview. I know I did. Love both his books. Get on it. Get them on your bookcase and get reading these. They're thoroughly enjoyable stories. And welcome, Alan Johnson, to episode 197 of the Spybrary Podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you, Shane. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. Very excited to speak with you. I read Late Train to Gipsy Hill in the summer. It was my summer read, and with everything that was going on in the world, it was quite a nice escape, I have to say.
Sure, except you ran straight into Russians and Ukrainians. I wrote it before Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and the heroes are Ukrainians and the villains are Russians, so I got that the right way around.
Before we get into your books, I have to say, so the two fiction books you've got out here, beautiful covers. And in our community of Spybrary, there's a lot of discussion around how banal and mundane most spy novels, in fact, a lot of books are. You must be pretty chuffed with these covers.
Oh, I'm delighted. So this is Wildfire, my publisher, which is part of Headline Hachette internationally. And actually, I ought to look up the name of the guy who did it. It was a guy. I've seen his name somewhere. He not only designed that, he designed the cover of my second book, which we'll come on to talk about. And I think they're beautiful designs. You know, as soon as I saw them, there was an unequivocal approval from me when the publisher said, how about this as a cover? God, how about it? It was fantastic. Really, really good covers. And I agree with you. So many dull book covers. And to me, the dust jacket on a hardback or the cover of a paperback is a crucial part of what you're buying, you know.
It really is. As I've just back from a trip to London and hit all the major bookstores there, and it was just so nice to wander and browse. And more often than not, it was the covers that were drawing me in. I was like, oh, this is intriguing. What's this book about? So I'm pretty confident there are a lot of readers out there, a lot of browsers that stumbled upon your books and were intrigued by the covers. So really well done on that. I think it makes a big difference.
Cover and the titles. The titles are very much to do with the publisher as well. I wanted to call that one Mascara. They said that's ridiculous. Then I wanted to call it something else. I mean, they know what they're doing. And I thought, you know, let's let's not have another train in the title of a book. There's so many trains around. But that was their judgment, and seemed to work, selling well.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Mascara. There's a book I've got next door. I'm yet to read it. And it kind of links in with your second novel in a way. John Stonehouse, the former MP. He wrote a book. I think he wrote several, but I've got one spy fiction book here called Ralph, with a very weird cover with makeup and a camera. And I can't remember who it was. Someone said it was one of the worst spy books ever written, which immediately got me to go out and buy it, but I've not a chance to read it.
Well, I'd be fascinated by that, purely on a let's experience it. But he was also the Postmaster General, John Stonehouse, when I became a postman way back in 1968. Post office was so big in the UK then that it had its own cabinet minister called the Postmaster General. And so I kind of followed him. And in my second book, we'll talk about the minister who goes missing. There's a slight suspicion that he might have done a John Stonehouse. You remember he left his clothes neatly folded on a beach in Miami and turned up in Australia. One thing you might have forgotten, Shane, because I certainly had, is he was caught because he tried to cash a cheque in, I think, Melbourne, in a city of Australia, I think Melbourne. And the cashier thought they recognised him and reported him, but they didn't think they recognised John Stonehouse. They thought they recognised Lord Lucan.
Wow.
Who'd gone missing at the same time. So he had the misfortune only to be caught because Lord Lucan had gone missing as well.
Crazy, isn't it? Crazy. So it was interesting. We had a Spybrary meetup, an in-person meetup. It was in Pimlico, just down the road from Millbank a couple of weeks ago. And we were talking about your work, and we were saying how your first book had a lot of espionage, spy elements. The second one, not so. And it was mooted that there was another author who did something very similar, Alan, and you will have heard of him. And that was John le Carré, because his first book, Call for the Dead, was very much a spy novel. The second book he wrote was very much a whodunit. And then the third book he wrote was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. So we're wondering, like, is this going to be Alan's next move?
Well, I'm writing the next one now, and it's not that. But that's really interesting. I only ever read A Small Town in Germany by John le Carré. But, of course, he was associated with the security services, and I was a former Home Secretary, so I had control of MI5. Sadly, not MI6. That's Foreign Secretary's brief. But I met a lot of what we call in Britain spooks. Huge admirer of them. And I really ought to read some more John le Carré now, because, you know, I didn't much enjoy A Small Town in Germany. I think I'll try The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I understand, Shane, that it sold a few copies, a few more than John Stonehouse's spy novel.
Yeah, a bit more than Ralph. So, I think Spy Who Came From the Cold is a good one to start with. And actually, Small Town in Germany was the one I tried to read in my 20s, and I couldn't get into it. And I didn't get the fuss around le Carré. And it's funny, it took me a little longer, probably 15 years later, before I actually finished a le Carré. So it does depend where you are in life.
Common, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I will say about both your books, and I mean this as a compliment, they're easy reading. By that, I mean you can fly through them. I found them intriguing, and I know quite a few people on the blurb said the same thing. I mean, I remember when I was reading it in the summer, I was late for a party because I was like, no, I have to see what happens here.
That was the whole aim. I mean, I'm not trying to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, but I am trying to produce something that's entertaining and is a page turner and reasonably well written, you know.
Absolutely. So both of your fiction books feature the police, security services, GCHQ make a brief appearance in the second one. How much did being a former Home Secretary help you in writing about the police and the security services and weaving them into your books?
Not much, I would say. When I go to book festivals, I get asked that question, and I say, I think I could have written these books if I'd never been Home Secretary. Because, you know, the things I witnessed and saw, which were incredible, but I can never talk about. I've signed the Official Secrets Act and all that. And if it was even moderately close to something that happened, I'd need Cabinet Office clearance and all that. So I wasn't interested in that. I think where it did help was the interaction between the security service and the police, which is much more interwoven than particularly in the fight against terrorism, that many people realise, and the way the police operate in Britain, the kind of rankings and the fact that, Peel's great genius when he created the police back in 19th century was that he would not have any military titles. So there are no captains, there are no colonels, there are no generals. He wanted them to be citizens in uniform. And so that helped. And I expose a bit of that in the book about my philosophy that we're very lucky in Britain with our police force compared to many other countries.
I actually have that quote here. It's something that I pulled out, and you wrote, "The commissioner had ruffled a few political feathers recently by giving a newspaper interview in which he'd mused that the reason some senior politicians and civil servants disliked what he described as the police meritocracy was because they couldn't pull strings on the old boy network as effectively as they could in practically every other sphere of public life."
Well spotted, Shane. That was me getting a few little political things off my chest.
Sure, absolutely. And one of my questions for you really is how difficult is it to keep politics out of your fictional work?
Oh, it's easy because, I'm determined to be a writer and former politician. So, people say to me, why isn't it not, like House of Cards or a political thriller? And that's because I wanted politics out of it. Politics is very much noises off stage. I mean, there is a minister, and, in the first book as well, there was a minister because, the police are very much associated with the Home Office. So there had to be a bit of that. But it's background, Late Train Gipsy Hill could just as well be described as a love story than a political thriller. And similarly, in One of Our Ministers Is Missing, there's a kind of love aspect to it as well. So a bit of romance, but basically a thriller that will not have people thinking, oh, God, here's Johnson banging on about, his last party manifesto.
And I commend you for that, because other than that quote I pulled out, I didn't really get anything that was too political.
No, good.
I commend you for
well
that.
done for pulling out the quote, though, Shane, because that was deliberately put there. I hope lots of police officers are reading that saying, yeah, quite right, Johnson. You're
yeah, you got it.
Yeah, with officer class, yeah.
So let's talk about the Late Train to Gipsy Hill. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, and I know there's quite a few Spybrarians who are in the middle of reading this right now, but Gary Nelson has a routine for the commute to his rather dull job in the city. Each day he watches as a woman on the train applies her makeup in a ritual he now knows by heart. He's never dared to strike up a conversation, but maybe one day. Then one evening on the late train to Gipsy Hill, the woman invites him to take the empty seat beside her. Fiddling with her mascara, she holds up her mirror and Gary reads the words, "Help me," scrawled in sticky black letters on the glass. From that moment, Gary's life is turned on its head. He finds himself on the run from the Russian mafia, the FSB, and even the Metropolitan Police, all because of what this mysterious young woman may have witnessed. In the race to find out the truth, Gary discovers that there's a lot more to her than meets the eye. How did you come up with this plot? What inspired you for this story?
Two things. First of all, Litvinenko. So I was a government minister when Litvinenko was poisoned in a London hotel, you remember, back in, I think, 2006. I was education secretary at the time. I was nowhere near that issue, but I heard a few cabinet discussions, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary involved. And it was audacious, of course. That was the first time, as Salisbury was to come a few years later, the audacity of the Russian criminal network. So that idea lodged there because I always thought, well, what would have happened if they served the tea the wrong way round, or the would-be poisoner actually drank the poisoned tea instead of the would-be victim? And that was happening. Then at the same time, I noticed, because this was after I'd been a minister for 11 years, in government for 13 years, and I hadn't used public transport very much because you have a government car running you around. When I was getting the train from Gipsy Hill to Victoria, walking down Victoria Street to Westminster, I noticed this phenomenon that I hadn't noticed before. So many women of all ages, mainly young women, put a full face of makeup on, sitting on a train, crushed by commuters. I mean, if you've ever travelled on Southern Rail, you know what I'm talking about. And on it goes in a very intimate process, as if they're sitting in front of their bedroom mirror. That fascinated me. So put the two things together. Irina, who's my Ukrainian woman waitress who gets the order mixed up, she's some of the guys, the guy who is poisoned, who is a member of Krovny Bratya, which is a Russian organized criminal gang. Some of his colleagues don't appreciate how easy a mistake it could make. So that is to make. So they're chasing Irina. Gary's my innocent abroad, sitting on the train, quite fancies Irina, plucks up the courage to talk to her, and then suddenly he's dragged into this because she's being chased not just by Krovny Bratya, but the Met want her back as well because she's left police custody when they were questioning her. So that's the start of it. And the more I thought it through, because I was desperate to get onto fiction, having written, 4 volumes of memoir, the better the idea was and the more it developed. And as I say, fortunately, although it was 3 years before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I had the heroes and villains the right way round.
Absolutely. And the scene on the train, so I used to live in South London, so I've seen that very scene, as you were. And I like the way you wrote about it because it wasn't in a creepy way. He doesn't come across as a pervert. He admires this woman. He fancies her, obviously, but you wrote it in a way that he does come across as innocent and it wasn't bad in any way. So I like that.
Good. He's shy and he feels that he's leading a very small life, and he came to London to lead a big life, and nothing's happened to him, no excitement, no adventure, and suddenly it's all happening. So I wanted him to be. I think you need an innocent abroad in novels like that. You need someone who is totally, wandering around, kind of lost in this world that others would understand, who are perhaps more mature, perhaps more experienced, and perhaps less reticent than Gary.
Are you familiar, or how familiar are you with the works of Eric Ambler?
Oh, I read lots about. I've spent my life as a reader, so I've read. Now that's a name you don't hear very often now, Eric. A bit like Dennis Wheatley on the kind of witchcraft side of witchcraft. Dennis Wheatley books, great thick tomes. I remember them, from my youth, and I remember Eric Ambler very well. Great. You'd call him a spy novelist?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would. And
I'd describe him as, but yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely a thriller writer as well, but I wonder if that seeped into your conscience then from your time reading Ambler, because most of his books had that innocent caught in a plot. That was the backbone of many of his thriller stories.
I'll have to reread him. Yeah.
So that's a compliment, by the way. That's like...
I've made 2 notes here. One is to reread Eric Ambler, and the other is to read the John Stonehouse book.
And actually, we have another list on the site, which Tim Shipman, who you may be familiar with,
I know him.
He's a big fan of the show, and he wrote, believe it or not, despite how busy the man is, he wrote his top 125 spy thriller writers of all time. He ranked them, and he wrote a whole description on each, 50,000 words, which I'll send you the link to that so you can peruse that. So that was
right. He also wrote the work, a studious work about what happened in the European referendum, of which I figure quite a lot in it. So Tim's one of my political writing heroes. So I'd love to see what he recommends on the thriller front.
I will email that to you. Let's get back to your work, though. Yeah. So you wrote that Gary was a romantic without a romance, an adventurer more reticent than intrepid where women were concerned, a buccaneer who'd yet to find his way to the sea. Love that. Love that. And then later on in the book, this one made me giggle. This lad isn't working for the Russians or the security services. He's a young clerical assistant from Aylesbury who somehow got himself mixed up in all this. Dale and O'Farrell may suspect him of being the spy who came in from accounts payable, but they know nothing about him.
Well, I got that idea from a lovely spoof on the front of Private Eye. You might remember when Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, there was some connection. He'd met someone, and the press were getting up a story that he had something to do with the Russian Secret Service. It was a load of rubbish. But Private Eye headed it as the spy who came in from the allotment. So that gave me the idea.
Brilliant.
For Gary. Yeah.
No, I like that. So that's Gary. That's our innocent. Our other hero here is Louise Mangan. What can you tell us about her, Alan?
Well, she's my hero. When I got the deal with the publisher, they wanted her. It was a 2-book deal. They wanted her in both books, and now it's a 3-book deal. They want her in the 3rd book as well. So she's a Christian. I'm not particularly religious, but I want to write about someone, and I'm not a woman, obviously. And she joined the police as a graduate in a real, a feeling that this is where, if she wants to do good in the world, this is a better place to do it than being a missionary somewhere. And she's been through all the trials and tribulations that a woman in the Met would have had joining in the 90s as she did. She was born in 1970. She's had a couple of kids. She was married to a copper. The pressures in the end told, marriage broke up, so she's now single, but loves being a detective. So she is, but she's got her enemies within the Metropolitan Police. She's got, the usual kind of problems you have at work as well, and the problems of being on her own now, empty nest syndrome. Both her daughters are at university. I like Louise very much, and I want her to be. She's not so much a super detective in that book, in The Late Train to Gipsy Hill. I mean, she's not Sherlock Holmes putting things together and observing stuff and all that. She's just doing her job as a policewoman and refuses to allow this Irina, my waitress, to just be thrown to the wolves, because there's a lot of political pressure. Let's just please the Russians. If she poisoned a Russian, not a Brit, let the Russians have her. And Louise is holding out against that. So she's very moral. In the 2nd book, I'm giving her a love interest with a Greek policeman. But I made a mistake, Shane. I promoted Louise Mangan at the end of The Late Train to Gipsy Hill to assistant commissioner. And in hindsight, that's a mistake, because assistant commissioners do a lot of good stuff, but it's administrative more than being on the tools. They're not detectives. So I had to find a way for her to be back on detective work, which is why in the 2nd book, one of our ministers is missing. The minister goes missing in Crete. The Greek police obviously have the upper hand. They're in charge. But as always, the Metropolitan Police will send a liaison officer out. If the person missing lived in the Metropolitan Police area, if they lived in Lancashire, it would be Lancashire Police. But this guy lived in London, Lord Bellingham. So they send, because it's a minister, they have to send quite a high-ranking police officer out there. That's Louise Mangan. Hey, presto, she's back doing detective stuff.
Absolutely. Was there any reason why you picked Crete?
I go there a lot, and me and my wife love it. And as we were driving around through the White Mountains, my wife said, I dedicate the book to her and say this was her idea, in the sense that she said, this would be a wonderful place for a minister to go missing. We were joking about me going trekking. And it's the kind of place where the thing about Crete is there's no wolves, there's no bears, there's no poisonous spiders, there's no venomous snakes. The only thing you got to worry about is another human being in those White Mountains. So it was the perfect location.
Yeah, I think it worked really well. I've never been, but you described it well, and I went online to look at it, because I'm a bit of a geek like that. And
go down to Agia Galini, because the great thing about Crete is on the north you're facing Europe, and on the south you're facing Africa. Yeah. So there's the Libyan Sea, which added another dimension to it for drug smuggling and people smuggling, etc. On the 2nd book.
Having read both of your fictional books, another compliment I want to pay you is you write females very well, and they're very strong. They're not damsels in distress. And, we just mentioned Le Carré. He wasn't particularly good at writing female characters. I think you're the opposite of that. They're very strong.
We know now from a memoir that was published recently, he had a lot of female contact, doesn't it?
Yes.
Goodness, could have known a lot about the opposite sex, but let's draw a veil over that and
Absolutely.
Get back to yeah.
So
thank you. I mean, I was raised by women, so my mother and my sister, the two heroes of my childhood memoir, and I've got 2 daughters, and I've had several wives. So I said, it's the challenge, isn't it, really? The challenge was me writing fiction, and that's a big challenge, swapping across from memoir, because memoir is a feat of memory, and fiction is a feat of the imagination. They both require you to be able to string a sentence together, yes, but, I didn't think you could call yourself a writer until you develop plot and character. Although, my memoirs won lots of very nice prizes, and I'm very proud of that. But so the challenge was writing fiction. Could I write that instead of from the male perspective, which I'm pretty au fait with? Can I write it from a woman's perspective? So when you say stuff like that, Shane, that really does warm the cockles of my heart, because that's what I wanted to do.
No, absolutely. And that's what I enjoyed about both books. That's why I was glad to see Louise Mangan back in the second one. And also, one of your female characters, it made me smile because you made her a season ticket holder of the greatest football team in the world. I am indeed a Swansea City supporter, so that raised a smile.
Good. Well, I'm glad about that. Yeah.
You don't often see Swansea City in a spy novel, so...
Are you Welsh then originally, Shane?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you're enjoying the World Cup at the moment then, particularly since they played USA recently. Yes, she's one of his flatmates, and he's really, in the end, well, I won't talk about the end, but there's a love interest there that wasn't there at the beginning. But yeah, thank you. Swansea City deserve a bit of a plug and a bit of a mention now. They're lounging down in the Championship.
Yes, which is far more exciting than playing in the Premier League and getting hammered every week. So we quite enjoy it. But
how I feel about Queen's Park Rangers, which is right.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, obviously, you've written a lot of politics, a lot of memoirs, won awards. What were the most challenging parts about writing fiction for you?
Bringing it all together at the end, because I tend to go off, I have an idea of where it's going. I kind of know where I want it to land, but very often the characters take it somewhere different, and I can't resist putting something in the middle of the book that I know will be a problem, amalgamating with the rest of the book at the end. But actually, that's part of the joy of it. That's what I love about it. I love the whole process of it. I love the writing, that nothing about that scares me. There's no tyranny of the blank page yet. That might happen. I love the solitude. I love the fact that I'm in complete control. It's my world. I can do what I like with it. And then I like the fact once it's published, the literary festivals, I'm just off to Gibraltar tomorrow to International Literary Festival there, doing these kind of podcasts. I love all that side of it as well. So there's nothing about writing that I don't like.
Yeah, brilliant. Good to hear it. 2 quick questions before you wrap up, because I'm going to be respectful of your time. First of all, if someone was to, with your music background, I've actually got In My Life, I've ordered it, it's on its way to me. I listened to the Spotify playlist to accompany it, so went the wrong way around. But if someone was to write the soundtrack, right, you could hire any band, living or dead, other than the Beatles, because that's too easy, to write the soundtrack for a film version of Late Train to Gypsy Hill. Who would it be?
I think it'd be John Grant, who's American, now based in Iceland, but his records, particularly Queen of Denmark, I love. And I went to see him in Nottingham. And I think he'd give it the right drama, the right sense of drama.
Excellent. Well, I'm not familiar, so I'll go and check them up and put it in the show notes. And secondly, what advice would you or have you ever given to a Home Secretary in terms of how they manage the relationship with MI5?
Well, I did talk to our Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas Simmons, who is no longer, he's Shadow Trade Minister now, but he took the trouble to contact me. I was the last Labour Home Secretary. I very much hope I'm not the last Labour Home Secretary, if you know what I mean. I would say, in terms of handling the relationship, be extremely respectful of these people because they don't have a voice. You are the only voice they have in the sense of being able to praise what they do, defend them. It's just like the police. You have your arguments with them behind the scenes if you need to, but that's where it stays. Publicly, you are their voice, and they are very brave and very dedicated people, and I have nothing but respect for them. So make sure you demonstrate that respect in all you do.
Marvellous, thank you. Late Train to Gipsy Hill is available in the US, isn't it?
Yes. Both books are available in the US. They're trying to get a US publisher, but they're doing it through Hachette.
Brilliant. So, because we have listeners both in US and UK, so I know it's available in UK and US. You can find that as well. I'll put all the links in the show notes, which is going to be spybrary.com/197. Alan, thank you very much for coming on the show. I loved both books. I highly recommend them. Great reading, and I'm really excited. We haven't got into it because I don't have time. I'm excited about your third one. Where are you going to go?
Yeah. Well, next September, you should find out.
Marvelous. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary Podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.